Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm James Shaheen, Tricycle's editor-in-chief, and I'm happy to be here with you today for a discussion on Yogacara with Professor William Waldron. Today's Zoom session will be recorded, and we'll share the replay link in a follow-up email. We'll be leaving time for questions at the end. You can ask a question by typing it into the Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen. If you type it into the chat, I may not see it. We'll get to as many of your questions as we can. Meanwhile, you can let us know where you're joining us from in the chat. Say hello. Let us know where you are. We'd love to hear that. This is a Tricycle Premium event, so a special welcome to our premium subscribers. We hold events like this every month for premium subscribers. Premium subscribers also receive one free digital gift subscription, a monthly newsletter from our in-house scholars, and a quarterly newsletter offering a behind-the-scenes look at our new issue. If you're not yet a premium subscriber, you can sign up at tricycle.org/subscribe or upgrade in your account. Finally, Tricycle is a nonprofit, and if you'd like to learn more about our mission or donate to Tricycle, visit tricycle.org/donate. Okay, again, I'm happy to be here with you today with Professor William Waldron. Bill teaches courses on Indian and Tibetan Buddhism at Middlebury College in Vermont, and sometimes at Rangjung Yeshe Institute in Kathmandu, Nepal. His work focuses on the classical Yogacara school of Indian Buddhism in dialogue with modern thought. He'll have an article in the May issue, so please keep an eye out for that. Although the February issue hasn't yet appeared, it's a ways away, but let this be an introduction to that. His earlier book, The Buddhist Unconscious, the Alaya Vijnana in the Context of Indian Buddhist Thought, was published in 2003. His more recent book, Making Sense of Mind Only, published by our friends over at Wisdom in 2023, is the first accessible English introduction to Indian Yogacara in Buddhism. Indian Yogacara Buddhism. He is currently working on a project on the 5 Buddha families. So one thing about the book, we're going to be putting a link in the chat. It's available digitally. It will soon be available in print also, but you can get a digital copy or a print-on-demand copy. And another thing about the book, it may sound intimidating. In fact, it's not at all. Bill provides the foundation you'll need in order to approach Yogacara with some background. So it's a highly accessible book, so I don't want all of these words to make it sound at all inaccessible, because in fact it is very accessible. And again, you get all the background you'll need to understand how he understands Yogacara and what it is. So we'll begin there. What is Yogacara? I know it's difficult to be concise, but what is Yogacara?
Well, first of all, thank you everybody for coming, and I'm really happy that people are interested in Yogacara enough to find some time in their busy lives. Yogacara Buddhism is, we could say, a school of Indian Buddhism. It developed in India starting around maybe the 2nd century of the Common Era, and it was produced quite a lot of new ideas and practices and texts right up through, you might say, into the 6th, 7th century, and thereafter became considered one of 2 major schools of Indian Buddhism, the other one, of course, being Madhyamaka. And it was deeply influential in later forms of Indian Buddhism, and then as it was transmitted into Tibet, and then into East Asia, China, Korea, Japan, and Vietnam. It was well studied and very influential in the Zen traditions there.
So who were the primary historical figures who systematized the school, and what were they responding to?
Oh, well, of course, that's the second part of that is a much larger question. The people who are most well known in the Yogacara tradition are 2 purportedly half-brothers, Asanga and Vasubandhu, and they were the ones who sort of wrote the most systematic texts and then commentaries on several sutras, Mahayana sutras, that we could consider to be Yogacara sutras, specifically the Samdhinirmochana Sutra. So these are the people who I really focus on, and I don't go historically after the time of Asanga and Vasubandhu for reasons that I'm sure we'll get into shortly. What they were responding to is that's an historical question. And that brings up the whole question about how we should approach our own study of Yogacara Buddhism. And do we want to think of it as a historical phenomenon that occurs in a historical context that is indeed responding to certain things going on in that context? Or do we want to think of it as some type of we could say a tenet system, which isn't really tied into a particular context? And this is the way that Tibetans have long thought about it. And if we think about it historically, which is sort of my approach, then it seems to me it's really clear that they are responding to questions and problems in the Abhidharma tradition that is preceded and contemporaneous with them. Vasubandhu was famously the author of the Abhidharma Kosha. And they are also in the context of early Mahayana. So they're a couple of centuries after the time of Nagarjuna. So in a way, what they're really trying to do is sort of bring together these two streams, Abhidharma, which is really focused on analyzing mind and mental processes in terms of these discrete events, you could say dharmas, and then the early Nagarjuna and early Mahayana, which is in the context of emptiness, that, well, dharmas are empty of their own existence and their own characteristics. And so what do we do with sort of these two streams? And I think it's really obvious that this is what Yogacara is dealing with. How do we talk about systematically and comprehensively about mind and mental events while not reifying the categories that we're using to analyze mind and mental events? And I think this is sort of the thread that they're kind of constantly weaving. And this is very clear if you read the text in the context, that this is the kinds of issues that are constantly coming up.
Mhm. Yeah, okay. So, you know, your book taught me a lot about Yogacara, both the received view and your own and others' view. The received view seems to be that it's the mind-only school and it's idealism. Nothing but mind exists. Is that fair to say that, in a nutshell, that is the received view? That's reductive, but it's this mind-only notion that mind only exists. Is that correct? I mean, from Asanga's 20 verses, people deduce from that, oh, or they say he's very plainly stating that only mind exists. Um, so can you just talk about the received view?
Yes, that is, I think, fair characterization of the received view. And this is a view that became uh, very popular and dominant, you could say, in later Indian Buddhism after the sectarian division between Madhyamaka and Yogacara arose a couple of centuries really after Asanga and Vasubandhu. And this is what the Tibetans inherited in terms of what is called the tenet system, or you could say the tenet systems. They're not, there's a variety of ways to treat this in the Tibetan orientation. That's very, I think, a fair way to talk about how it's treated in the tenet systems. The chitta matra, mind only, means that only mind exists and objects do not exist, which is an ontological kind of position, you could say, talking about what the characteristics of objects are and of mind. And of course, this is much less the case in East Asian Buddhism, though you do certainly still see this term mind only. Hui shi is the Chinese or yushiki in Japanese for mind only. And they don't ontologize it as much. That is, talk about the substantial existence of mind, but it's the same general orientation. Yeah, I think
Mhm.
that's quite fair.
And we might refer to that as idealism, that mind only exists. But you feel that over time, the school evolved
Uh,
in a direction that was inconsistent with your understanding of Asanga and Vasubandhu's original formulations. Can you tell us about that? Why do you push back against what has become the received mind only view?
well, the main reason that I push back against this is because um, I was very enamored with dependent arising really from the beginning of my exposure to Buddhism, and the notion that we really have to understand things in terms of how they arise dependent on causes and conditions, which are interactive processes. And if you read Yogacara from that point of view, in terms of dependent arising, then it seems pretty clear to me. Now, obviously, people disagree later on in Indian Buddhism, but what they are doing is being faithful to this mode of analysis, of looking at how things arise dependent on causes and conditions. And that includes, very importantly, the notion that we often translate as consciousness, vijnana. Consciousness is not a very helpful term in many ways. It doesn't have a very specific meaning in English. And mind, it also doesn't have a very specific meaning. And so we end up fudging and muddling through when we talk about consciousness and mind a lot of the time because we're not being very precise. In the formula of dependent arising, vijnana, which is the original term, arises when something impinges on a faculty and there is awareness. Vijnana is a form of awareness. And this occurs. It's something which happens in an interactive process. And the other name for Yogacara, a very common term is Vijnanavada. So if you look at Yogacara as a, a school that focuses on how Vijnana arises, following the syntax or the formula of dependent arising, then it seems really clear to me that they are just continuing this same mode of analysis. And from that point of view, then they are not asserting that mind exists somehow independently or substantially of these interactive processes. And you got to read the texts carefully in order to see that. And you have to read the text, especially the 20 verses, as an integral composition rather than cherry picking out one passage or another and saying this is what Yogacara means.
Hmm. So in other words, by grounding this in the early teachings, there's, in other words, no discontinuous break with the earlier teachings. It's a further evolution of thought. And by grounding it in dependent arising, just a quote from you, dependent arising involves interactive processes, not independent entities. That's pretty much what you were saying earlier. By grounding it in that, you're finding a middle ground between idealism and realism, between mind only and an objective reality separate from our perception of it, right? So can you talk about that? This sort of in this way, we might think of Yogacara early on as sort of pushback against the essentialism of the Abhidhamma. Is that correct? Or um,
Well, I would look at in many ways as Nagarjuna has kind of pushed back against that, and that
mhm,
they you could say inherited that position as Mahayanists.
mhm.
The dharmas, these sort of these categories and ways we think about how mental events and processes and physical events and processes occur, that they do not have an inherent existence or inherent characteristics. They're they're accepting in a sense that the phenomena, the categories are empty of all of that. But what they are also interested in doing is improving, in a sense, the Dharma system. There, in many ways, the whole Alaya Vijnana complex is is really just an emendation, an addition, an improvement, you could say, of the Abhidharmic mode of analysis, with a constant caveat that dharmas are empty.
Okay, can you tell us what Alaya Vijnana is? Because I don't think a lot of people will know that term. Storehouse consciousness?
Yeah, sorry, and I didn't answer the question about idealism either. Um, Idealism is sort of a contested term in many ways, and I think it's because in the Tibetan tenet system, it gets associated with Chittamatra, and it's always called Yogacara idealism. And in that system, it's a claim that mind exists substantially and only mind, not matter or objects. Whereas in the sort of Western philosophy, German idealism is more consistent with a recognition that naive realism is naive, that we aren't just simply seeing objects external to us in an empirical fashion, that the way that the mind construes or the way that the categories in which we experience the world are part of our mental capacities. And that form of idealism is, I think, much less clearly mental substantial, less clearly states that mind exists substantially. And I think a lot of the confusion about idealism comes from sort of the Tibetan orientation on one side and then the German idealists on the other. And we're often not using even the same definitions when we talk about idealism. And this comes up repeatedly in Buddhist studies circles.
Yeah, somebody just is
Uh-huh.
writing here. Eddie Vegan Dao writes, by the way, Yogacara arrived in China in the early 5th century. Buddhism began in Tibet in the 7th century. I'm not sure exactly what the point there is, but Yogacara arrived first in China. Is that correct? Yeah, I'm not sure exactly what the question is, but we'll move on.
May I make one more point?
Yes.
I think it's really important to recognize that the formula of dependent arising, the orientation of dependent arising, is neither idealism nor realism.
Hmm.
It is about interactivism or interbeing, as Thich Nhat Hanh likes to translate it. It's neither realism nor idealism, and therefore, insofar as Yogacara is a continuity with the orientation of dependent arising from the beginning, it is neither idealistic nor realism. These are just not very useful categories.
Right. I- if I mean, my understanding of Yogacara
Uh-huh.
was very different until I read the book because I wasn't particularly educated about it.
Uh-huh.
But like many, I mean, if I were just to read the song as 20 verses, I might just come away and think, oh, he's saying it is mind only, or that only mind exists. But you explain that because you feel that if I were just to read that, it would be true that it lacked context, any historical context. Can you say something about that? Because I did hear somebody say, well, I read the song is 20 verses,
Right.
and this is what he's saying.
So there are 20, actually 22 verses there.
Hmm.
And a couple of the verses say that Vasubandhu says that he is not refuting objects per se. He's refuting the svalakshana of objects. That is the own characteristic of objects. And then he says that Vijnapti Matra, and that is that Vijnapti Matra we could translate as appearance only. Sometimes it's translated as consciousness only or representation only. What he is saying is that this is an introduction to the selflessness of dharmas in the 10th verse. That the idea that what we experience are appearances is an introduction to the selflessness of dharmas, and that he is not refuting their existence completely. That's in the 20 verses.
Hmm.
So one of the methodological questions that is raised by reading the 20 verses, do we take his statement that this is an introduction to the selflessness of dharmas seriously? Does this also govern the first verse where he says that objects or artha, which isn't exactly the same as object, but close enough, are representations or appearances? He's saying that this is just refuting the notion that they have their own characteristics, that
Hmm.
they're empty, which is just straightforward Mahayana. There's nothing different about this other than instead of saying they don't logically exist independently, he's saying they have no independent characteristics. And the reason they don't is because they are dependently arisen phenomenon.
So I just want to repeat to everybody, those of you who
Uh-huh.
may have come later, we are including a link to the book in the chat. Right now, it's available in digital form. It will soon be available also in print, and you can get print on demand. And if any of this has lost you, or if any of this discussion has lost you, I can tell you that the book will make it pretty clear. We're just jumping into topics that may seem a little obscure, but in fact, the great thing about this book is that it clarifies these rather complex issues, and it doesn't require a deep background in Buddhism because that's provided also. Um, so, Bill, you write you ground all of this in how we actually live our lives in the soteriological goal of Buddhism of liberation. So you understand Yogacara as answering the question, under what conditions do illusions occur, and how can we learn to see through them? So it's easy to get lost uh, in uh, in all of the philosophical debate. And forget that there's an actual practice here that frees us. So, what conditions give rise to illusion, according to Yogacara, and how can we learn to see through that illusion and become freer?
Yes, I think this is one of my main motivations really of writing the book, and especially the way that I have, is to bring out this dimension or this aspect of Yogacara teachings. Because in a way, we all suffer from illusion. And illusion is that things do not exist in the way that they appear. It doesn't mean they don't exist. It doesn't mean they're fake. It just means they don't exist in that fashion. We suffer from all kinds of illusions in our world, in our lives. And I mean, this ties in with, the biggest illusion that we are some type of independent, unchanging entity, right? This is classic Buddhist notion of no self. But Yogacharans are interested in really a much deeper analysis of how cognition occurs. Cognition or cognitive awareness is how I like to translate Vijnana. Cognition occurs, and especially at a non-conscious level, it, our way that we experience the world is constructed and informed by all kinds of causes and conditions that operate non-consciously. So that when we, for example, see this as a water bottle, all of us recognize right away it's a water bottle. Well, we recognize it right away because we've learned the term water bottle. We learn what it's used for. We have developed all these neural pathways, you could say. And how do we know that this isn't just the way that it appears? Well, we can think about a neonate, a one-day baby or 1 week old baby does not recognize objects visually, not just because they don't have language or names, but also because their visual cortex is not wired up with their retina cells. We have to learn how to recognize objects as discrete things, so to speak. And a lot of that comes about through socialization and acculturation, that become deeply habituated, and we would say now neurologically, they become deeply habituated so that we experience the world in the categories that we've been socialized and acculturated into. And this happens automatically. These are the deep illusions that we labor under when we think that one culture or one society has somehow a monopoly on truth and we know the world exactly as it is. It's really clear, it seems to me, that appearances are very misleading. If we think about chemistry and physics and biology and immune systems and all of these other invisible forms of causal processes that we now know an awful lot more about, it's really clear that the way we experience the world is deeply informed before we're even conscious of it. And there's a passage that I think is in some ways really motivates me to bring out this dimension of Yogacara teachings from the Samdhinirmochana Sutra, which is Mahayana Sutra, and scholars date this to around second or third century or so. And the passage says that our non-conscious cognitive processes arise dependent on the following factors. And notice that this is the formula of dependent arising with a few extra things put in, you could say. And our our non-conscious cognitive processes arise dependent on, quote, the appropriation that consists of our tendencies towards proliferating everyday expressions about characteristics, names, and perceptions. In other words, non-consciously, we're constantly dealing with everyday expressions about characteristics, names, and preconceptions about other people, about things. And we're proliferating and associating all kinds of ideas and feelings and reactions to all of that. And this is part of what we're attached to. The appropriation means taking as one's own. We are attached to our own social and cultural ways of perceiving the world and our own idiosyncratic ways of perceiving the world, and we don't see them clearly. This takes a lot of work in order to understand our own preconceptions and assumptions. And this is a big part of what the meditative exercises are about, is analyzing what our perceptions are, analyzing our responses to these perceptions, and recognizing that a lot of what we imagine that we perceive are in fact constructed by all of these various factors. And that's what I think Vijñapti Matra means, the notion that this is an appearance only. This is liberating when we recognize that these are constructed, that these are constructed by various causes and conditions. So that's the reason they arise in that fashion. It doesn't mean they're totally fake, but they're constructed and they're not totally true either.
I think you also mentioned in the book how, of course, different species are seeing something
Yeah,
entirely different.
yeah, yeah.
If you take what a fly's eye might see, it's going to be an entirely different reality, one that is adaptive. So you mentioned social and cultural, and I'll get to that in a moment, but also innate. Our faculties are our faculties, and they're biological. So they're so deeply rooted that someone might say, "Yeah, this meditative practice may be great, but how deeply can you really go to free yourself of the prison of that particular um, way of seeing things?"
We merely need to recognize, in my understanding, of course,
Hmm.
which is limited, we merely need to recognize that they are, in fact, constructs. Appearances are constructs. This is actually not news from any kind of postmodern point of view.
Hmm.
We don't have to get rid of those appearances in order to be free from them. We just have to see their constructs.
Hmm. And they're necessary.
And they're necessary. You don't want to walk in front of a truck, even though, the all of the various sort of mites, we have all kinds of little bacteria on our skin, etc. They don't recognize a truck coming down the road. So obviously this is a human construct. That doesn't mean it's not going to hurt when you walk in front of it.
Right. So I think though that there are constructs, but there are good ones and bad ones. I mean, there are ones that
Yeah,
help
yeah,
us to
yeah, yeah.
flourish, and there are destructive ones. This is something you've written about for us as well. Again, in May, people will get a chance to look at that. But how do we develop that discernment? And
That's a really good question. If we think about the three natures, which is an important sort of we could say conceptual construct in Yogacara, it's really a development, you could say, of uh, the difference between phenomena appearing in a certain way and them being empty. So the three natures in general is we have the first one, which is the falsely imagined nature, which is that we imagine things have their own independence and their own characteristics. That is, they have essences. The dependent nature in the Samdhinirmochana Sutra is word for word the formula of dependent arising. So why do we imagine or why do we see things in terms of having their own independent characteristics? It's because our cognitive processes operate that way. Our cognitive processes reify things, where we imagine that processes are unchanging entities, are essences. So illusion occurs because of the factors that I just mentioned before in the Samdhina Sutra. It occurs because they're informed by preconceptions and characteristics and conceptual proliferation, etc. And we can learn to see through that and to see things as truly empty, the third nature. And so, therefore, the distinction that they're making that is really useful is the construct of unchanging entities and unchanging characteristics leads to attachment, it leads to blindness, it leads to illusion. Whereas if we can learn to analyze and see things as dependently arisen, which of course is what the Buddha taught, is what Nagarjuna taught, etc. If we can see them as dependently arisen, we are freed from these preconceptions. We can learn to see through these preconceptions and see that they occur in a particular way, in a particular place for particular people, given their particular causes and conditions, which is largely cultural and social, though not only, because we're human beings and as a species, we experience the world in a certain kind of way. But we can recognize that that arises because of the structure of our faculties, not because we're seeing things exactly as they are.
Right. But, we're living at a time when people are doing a lot of deconstructing. I mean, our
Yeah, yeah,
institutions
yeah, yeah.
seem to be, some would say, in collapse, or at least people don't find them credible. And we may be a little bit erred on the side of deconstruction. Like, just because they're constructed, of course, doesn't mean they don't have value. Again, there are ones that are useful and there are ones that are pernicious. Um, how do you see that balance between seeing through these say institutions as constructed, or even our perception of them as constructed,
Right.
and the danger of simply tearing them down?
You
Uh,
know, this is the issue that is raised directly in the Samdhina Sutra. And if we think about the Samdhina Sutra as historically, as occurring a couple centuries after the beginning of Mahayana, after the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, after Nagarjuna, then we can understand how they're framing the question that they're framing. And that is, the sutra says, if everything is just empty, if it just lacks essence, if it just lacks characteristics, then how can anything be useful? How can any teaching be kind of useful? What is a bodhisattva supposed to do if everything is unilaterally empty and negated, right? So this is the same issue that we are facing now in the wake of, you could say, postmodernism, but it's not simply postmodernism. Every science and every discipline has effectively gotten rid of the notion of unchanging essences and looks at things, maybe not everyone, but most, and they look at things in terms of how they occur in context. So this is a very similar kind of moment, you could say, that the early Mahayanas, including Yogacharans, are addressing. And the question is, we need to have useful constructs that acknowledge the dependent arising of phenomenon and that acknowledge our place within creating these constructs. And that is a sense then, in my interpretation, that the responsibility for creating useful constructs falls back onto ourselves. We have to be able to articulate how we can have valid knowledge that is not absolutely objective, because we can't claim to have that type of knowledge, but is nevertheless is functional, is skillful. And to me, from the point what the Yogacharans and Mahayana in general actually are, the position that they're taking in relation to this is this needs to be motivated by bodhicitta, by the aspiration to become awakened for the benefit of all beings. So we need to think about what is skillful for alleviating suffering, for alleviating illusion, and what is not skillful. And that's not going to be the same thing in every single context, in every time and place. There are 84,000 dharmas, as the Buddhists say, because there are 84,000 forms of afflictions. So the distinction then, I know this is a long answer, the distinction that you're saying between sort of useful deconstruction and the deconstruction that leaves us lost, so to speak, is what is going to lead towards liberation.
I guess what I was asking and what you answered is how do we avoid tipping into nihilism? And it is not nihilism, but it's easily taken for that if we're not careful. Um, I would like to turn to our listeners or our viewers and ask a few of their questions. John Hacker Wright asks, to build on the parallel with German idealism, does Yogacara hold that there are structures to the way the mind shapes experience, as does Immanuel Kant? Can you say something about that? And I think you touched on that, but go ahead.
Yeah, that was the gist of the passage that I read about the from the Samdhinimochana Sutra. In a sense, you could say that the tendencies to proliferating everyday expressions about characteristics, names, and preconceptions are the structures, so to speak, that pre-structure the way that we consciously experience the world. And I think this is a very similar kind of orientation that you could say that Kant is taking as well, that we experience the world in certain kinds of ways because of the way that mind is structured.
Okay, again, you can post your question in the Q&A tab. Please avoid the chat because I'm looking at the Q&A tab. The next question comes from the Louisville Vipassana community. If you're familiar with the idealism philosopher Bernardo Kastrup, do you see an overlap with your position?
I'm not familiar with him.
Oh, okay. All right. Sorry, Louisville, but
Sorry.
maybe later. So Matthew Nyman asks, does the distinction between conventional and ultimate realities come into this discussion?
Oh yeah, very much so. In insofar as Yogacara is, as I understand it, very mainstream Mahayana, then what they're saying is ultimately we cannot really describe reality, ta ta ta. It is ineffable. And so, in a sense, then, what the Samdhinimochana Sutra is stating very clearly is therefore all doctrines are conventional, including Yogacara doctrines, including very specifically Chitta, Manas, and Vijnana, the terms that are typically translated as forms of mind and mental processes. The fifth chapter of that sutra says the secrets that about mind that bodhisattvas know is that they are empty. So even the Yogacara doctrines, as we see in other forms of Buddhism, need to be let go of along the path because they are just conventional rafts, so to speak, not something to be held on to.
Okay, so Philip Delaray asks, if no one is in a forest and a tree falls, does it make a sound? No, since the sound needs to be perceived. Extending this to today's subject, objects do not exist if no mind is there to perceive them.
Is that a question or a
Yeah,
statement?
yeah, that's a question. There's a question mark at the end of it. Maybe,
Oh, okay.
yeah.
So there's a really nice passage in the early text that somebody is asking who craves, asking the Buddha. This is in the early Pali text. And the Buddha says, I do not say who craves. This is not a fit question. I say, under what conditions does craving arise? This is, in other words, dependent arising. The mode of analysis of dependent arising. The mode of analysis of dependent arising is not asking about whether things exist or don't exist. These are two extremes, the Buddha says, and Nagarjuna reiterates in his Mula Madhyamaka Karikas. We do not say what exists or don't exist. We say under what conditions do things arise. we might say, under what conditions does the question about whether things exist or don't exist arises? Under the conditions in which we think in terms of essences, we think in terms of essential characteristics. That's the conditions in which we ask this question. And the three natures would suggest we should transpose that question back into how do appearances arise? And the problem, as I understand it, the problem with phrasing things like about what exists or not is this is using the methodology of essences. It's using the methodology or the orientation of the falsely imagined nature and thinking that this is what Yogacharans are talking about. It's actually what they're critiquing. We don't talk about existence or non-existence because these are two extremes. We talk about dependent arising. And that seems to be a very, very difficult point because we have been taught that Yogacara and Chittamatra is all about whether things exist or not. This is not what these texts are saying. It is what the later interpretations are saying, but it's not what these texts are saying.
Okay, there's a question that was asked earlier. So an anonymous attendee writes, "Thank you. This may be addressed later," meaning later. Do Yogacara teachers address the issue of how dependent arising seems to be a discernible, coherent, stable, dependable middle ground system rather than a deterministic or disordered system?
Well, that's interesting. I actually don't know where they talk about that because uh, I would say, I'm guessing disordered means something like random. It's the middle way, you could say, between determinism and a causality. I don't know that they'd address that specifically any place. Um, Certainly, the Buddha does mention that in the early texts. It's not determinism and things are not just simply random. It's the middle way between that.
Okay, so Logan Green says, "Are you familiar with the work of Iris Berendt? She cites very compelling research that many aspects of perception are innate."
No, I'm not familiar with that, but I am largely familiar with cognitive science and how they talk about perception. The word innate means born with, and that it means that we have the genetic disposition, you could say, to develop certain types of faculties, and those faculties are going to structure the way that we respond to something impinging upon them, so that we can have a tendency to experience the world in certain kinds of ways. And this is, I think, the gist of comparing human experience with that of a gnat or a fly or a bat or a whale or something like that. But innate, we need to remember that innate means something that is constructed and come about through causes and conditions. It doesn't mean inherent.
Okay, so Douglas Gentile asks, perhaps this is too detailed for this discussion, but in your view, are there important differences between Vasubandhu's 20 verses, 30 verses, and 100 Dharma texts? What is he trying to do with these different pithy texts?
Uh, that's a good question. The 30 verses is just 30 verses, right? And so it's a synopsis, you could say, of this whole Yogacara system. And the 20 verses is really oriented towards the theme of Vijñapti Matra, of sort of appearance only. And so in a way, it's a very focused text. It doesn't bring in the three natures. It doesn't bring in the past much at all. It needs to be set in the larger Yogacara context.
Philip Moffat, hi Philip, asks,
I feel.
will you please go through storehouse consciousness in some detail?
Yeah, sorry, I didn't answer that earlier when you asked me about that.
Mhm.
Um, we don't have enough time to go into it in great detail, but I do that in my first book, which was many years ago. The way that I interpret Alaya Vijnana is, as before, in terms of dependent arising. The most systematic texts that are written by a Sangha, actually, in the Yogacara Bhumi, describe Alaya Vijnana in Abhidharmic terms, in terms of the conditions under which forms of non-conscious processes, cognitive processes occur. And a bunch of those I mentioned before in that passage from the Samdhinamochana Sutra. What I think ultimately what they are trying to address is questions about continuity of mind, of chitta. You could say chitta santana, the stream of mind, over time, over not just one lifetime, but many lifetimes, along with, and this is, I think, what becomes crucial here, along with the uh, karmic potentiality. Karmic potentiality means we do a certain action, an intentional action at one time, and the fruition of that comes about at another time. So in the meantime, there's a potentiality for that karmic fruition to come about. And this, in a sense, is one of the characteristics of what it means to have a being through samsara, is existing or flowing through samsara. The other one is the latent afflictions. So while I'm not really angry right now, I'm very enthusiastic because I love talking about this, and thank you all for being here. But I will get angry probably when I read about politics or some bullshit like that. Um, I have the potential, the tendency to get angry or to get lustful or whatever. But that's not present right now. But these tendencies, especially the tendency towards I am, towards grasping I am an individual being, last until very, very far along the path. So we have these tendencies and these karmic potentialities that occur in the stream of mind through time, but they're not directly affecting every single moment of awareness. But a lot of what the Abhidharma tradition is focused on is what is going on right now. We see this a lot in the practices of mindfulness. What's going on right now? What's occurring right now? What's occurring right now? And to the extent that they say the only thing that is real is what is occurring now, then how do you deal with questions about potentiality and latent tendencies? Because they're not occurring right now. But we know by definition almost that they're going to be occurring in the future. So how do you understand multiple layers of mind, so to speak? The analogy in the Samdhinamochana Sutra is really clear. You could think about the mind as a stream, and it has deep currents and it has a surface which is buffeted by winds, so to speak. And the deep currents are in alaya vijnana. There are these deeper processes that are kind of ongoingly occurring, though that are not karmically overwhelming, such that our latent tendencies are going to prevent us from being kind and compassionate, etc. And that our karmic potentiality is not going to interfere with every single thing that we do at the moment. I think this is the gist of what is going on with alaya vijnana. And it also incorporates this idea that we have cognitive schemas, which I think is a really good translation for samskara, that allow us to experience the world in certain kinds of ways. These are not conscious as well, and they were difficult problems for Abhidharmists to account for. So this is another part of what is in the Alaya complex, you could say. So it brings together various strands of what we might call Abhidharma problems that almost all have to deal with questions of continuity. So the analogy is deep currents.
I'm going to break my rules. Somebody wrote something in the chat. Shozan asks, why do you think later Yogacara moved away from the early ideas of Yogacara? Do you think as Yogacara becomes more well known in Western Buddhism, there is a movement back to the early Yogacara ideas?
I'm not entirely sure that the later Yogacarans did move away from that. I haven't studied later Indian Buddhism anywhere near the same depth as I have the first 1,000 years. And we got to remember these are long periods of time that we're talking about. Um, I think it has been construed in different kinds of ways. But I also think, to the extent that it was construed differently, a lot of what was going on in India was people were competing for patronage. This is what historians say. And competing for patronage means you have to appeal to Hindus, you have to appeal to rulers who are interested in kind of concrete, you know, political realism, so to speak. And they've started to formulate things in when one might say more ontologically, because this is the way that Hindus were talking. So if you want to join the debate, so to speak, then you're going to start talking more about ontological issues, what exists or doesn't exist, rather than how do illusions dependently arise and how do we overcome them.
I'll ask a more lighthearted question. I heard you speak once about a Donovan song that is congruent with Yogacara thought. Are there any other songs that you can point us to? And I was happy to come across Bob Dylan lyrics in your book. So can you suggest any other songs
Any other songs that have Yogacara themes?
resonant, yeah, with Yogacara? Uh,
There's a couple songs called Bodhisattva, one by what is it, the Beastie Boys
yeah.
and Steely Dan. I don't know about the lyrics that much. Um, I haven't been asked that question before.
Okay.
There,
So
there are, I could say, there's just this as a teaser. There are at least six non-identifiable quotes from rock songs in the book.
okay. Stephen Lowinger asks, do you agree with my view of the main usefulness of the three natures as a model, like all of what the Buddha taught, is that it immediately creates a sense of uncertainty of the experience and makes it easier to remove attachment?
Yeah, I think the whole point of Vijnapti Matra is saying that things are appearances, is to make us question how appearances are constructed and how we respond to them, afflictively or whatever. It's to question appearances and our automatic association that we've learned, that we've been acculturated into. And this is exactly true. And it's the same motivation as all the analytic meditations that we see in Buddhism. What is the self? Where is the self? Where is consciousness? It creates this big doubt, the great doubt that the Zen people talk about.
Okay. Haridas Heights asks, how does identification with the projections of alaya vijnana relate to personal karma? Again, a storehouse consciousness question.
So the other innovative notion about how mind operates in Yogacara, classical Yogacara, is called the Klishta, which is, you could say, afflicted mentation or afflicted ego. It's sometimes translated as. This is a way of thinking about what self-grasping is at a non-conscious level. You might almost say our kind of survival instinct, as it were. In the classical Yogacara text, it says that what we take as I and that we cherish and love and think is truly real is alaya vijnana. That is these deeper currents that are ongoingly being reproduced moment to moment to moment to moment, that are based upon our history, based upon our embodiment, based upon our kind of emotional dispositions, etc. This is what we think that we are. I am this. This is my body. These are my feelings. These are my thoughts. So, and this is operating, they say, moment to moment at a non-conscious level. And when we start to then get motivated by them and act at a more conscious level, act out intentional actions, this is when they become karmically efficacious. But they're all sitting there waiting, so to speak. These are buttons that are waiting to be pushed.
We have so many wonderful questions. We were not going to get to them all, but I just want to say how grateful we are for these questions. This one may gobble up some time. Can you say anything about the debate between Yogacara and Madhyamaka on perceiving the mind, referred to by Shantideva in chapter 9 of the Bodhicharyavatara?
I can say something about that. I think it's a very abstruse chapter that people have a very difficult time understanding who is making which argument for what. I don't know who they are referring to. I don't know who Shantideva is referring to. I don't know who Chandrakirti is referring to when they make these statements. This is not a Sangha and Vasubandhu as I read them. So it could be other people, just like clearly there were people who took emptiness to be simple nihilism, and therefore you can do whatever you want because there's no morality, there's no karma, etc. Some people were like that. So similarly, you could find some people who are off at the middle way of Yogacara that or perhaps who Shantideva and Chandrakirti are talking about, but I don't know who they are.
Okay, one last question. Alexander Nagel asks, how was Yogacara transformed and adapted in Japanese Zen? How is it expressed in Zen today?
Oh, that's a difficult question. I'm not an expert at all in East Asian Buddhism. Um, the one of the main important texts in the beginning of and to this day in some ways in Chan and Zen is the Lankavatara Sutra. And so this understanding, I think, in particularly of alaya vijnana, with the world is appearances that are constructed that we need to be able to see through as clearly as possible, is a very important part of Zen teaching. And every once in a while, you see, I think, very overt echoes, if I could put it that way, in uh, in Zen teachings that come from Yogacara. But I'm not an expert in this in East Asian Buddhism.
This may
Oh,
take,
can I say one
yeah.
other thing? Thich Nhat Hanh is the person to go and to read about this
Mhm. Yeah,
because
when
he's
we were
what?
when we were
Yeah,
speaking earlier, you were saying that
yeah.
his view seems to be consistent with your take on Yogacara.
Much more so. And one of the reasons for this possibly is because Vietnam is the only Buddhist country that has that's a Mahayana Buddhist country with a very strong Theravada presence in the southern part of Vietnam with Cambodian ethnics. And so he has been exposed to the early canonical teachings right from the very beginning. And so he sees and he makes many commentaries on them. And he sees the continuity between early Buddhist teachings in the early canon and Yogacara, I think to a great degree. So maybe even unconsciously, I'm not sure, but my understanding of Yogacara is greatly influenced by his teachings.
Okay, I wish we could continue, but I think that's all the time we have. Thank you, Bill,
Okay,
and
thank you.
thank you everyone for joining us. And again, I'd like to recommend the book. I mean, again, if you were lost in certain areas, and the book clarifies a lot. We'll send a replay of this event and a follow-up email later today. There are far more of you who are not here than who will receive it. Also, for those of you who haven't seen it yet, TriSchool just launched a Substack, which is a great place to follow up on this conversation and connect with your fellow subscribers. We'll start a chat about this event and hope you'll join us there to continue the conversation. On Substack, we'll also include a link to the book. I should mention that Wisdom is also a not-for-profit, and when you get the book, you're supporting another worthy cause. Again, Tricycle is a nonprofit. If you'd like to donate to Tricycle, visit tricycle.com/donate or tricycle.org/donate. The best way to support us is to subscribe, which you can do by visiting tricycle.org/subscribe. Thanks again, Bill. Any parting comments?
Well, thank you all again for showing interest in this topic. Um, I I hope I haven't been too academic or too scholastic. Um,
Not at all.
okay, I should say that I was fortunate enough to share drafts of the Yogacara chapters, which don't actually start until about page 140. I shared those drafts with some people at the Zen Mountain Monastery in upstate New York, and they kept asking me, "What do I do with this? What do I do with this? How does this affect my practice?" And it made me reformulate so many parts of the book to kind of think about that as my intended audience. So if you sort of identify with that as your interest, this has been very much a part of the way that the book kind of got formulated in process. So I have great thanks to them for that, and I hope that you all find it interesting and helpful.
Thank you again, Bill. I have to say that Yogacara has not really been my focus in my practice, and it was a wonderful introduction to it, and it cleared up a lot of misconceptions of my own. And what I also really appreciate about it is that you really do focus on how does this actually affect the way I live my practice in our social and political world. So thank you for that, Bill. And thank you to all of you for coming, and I hope you take a look at the book and again visit us on Substack if you'd like to learn more about it. So great.
Okay,
Thanks.
thank you all.
Thank you.